Good morning, everyone. So to get us started this morning, what I'd like to do, actually first I just want to say that I think the work you all do is so important. And this weekend I noticed that 0 to 3, some of the tweets 0 to 3 has been sending out. And I just wanted to acknowledge and appreciate that in this time there's this notion that organizations often are afraid to speak out on important issues and speak out on values. And I think this is a time that speaking out on values is most important. And I'm going to be talking a lot today about values. And I think sometimes people mistake speaking out on policy versus speaking out on values. And when we're an organization or network that's about the livelihood of young children, and that's a high value to us, speaking out on issues that affect young children is important. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that I've been very impressed with seeing how 0 to 3 is standing up and not being silent at this time. To get started, what I'd like you to do, though, usually I have people like sitting together, and you're all in an incredibly random design from here. So what I'm asking you to do is group with however many people you can around yourselves. And what I'd like you to think about is if you were to create the worst team or collaboration possible, what would you put in place to create that? So I'd like you to think just if you were to create a team where you spent more time in the parking lot complaining about every meeting than you spend in each meeting, where when you see it on your calendar you groan, I want you to think about how do you create that? What principles or practices could you put in place? Go. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Can I get a sample of some of your greatest hits? What do you got? Everyone speaks a different language. Literally or figuratively almost, right? Yeah, both. I was just processing it. Yeah, cool. What else? No shared vision.
No coffee provided at meetings.
No coffee provided at meetings. No honesty. Not including the intended beneficiaries or those impacted by our work. What else? Autocrats. Too many egos. No communication. You guys are really good at this. And the reason is it goes back to the Peter Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That a lot of times we talk about these principles of how to create collaborations, how to do strategic work, but what we also often miss is that you have to be as rigorous about culture and leadership as we are about strategy and impact. And so often we miss thinking about what kind of leadership does it take? What kind of values do we have to practice? What are the principles we have to put in place to succeed? And so that's what we're going to talk about this morning. And I want to first just start and share a little bit about the work that I've been doing in collective impact. But really, mostly, we're going to talk about leadership. And yes, we're going to be talking to each other more. First, I want to share, I was part of something called the White House Council for Community Solutions. And we were charged by the former president, to identify how our community is solving problems. And a lot of people came to us and said, let's find those evidence-based solutions and scale them. Let's focus on finding evidence-based solutions and scale them. And that made a certain amount of sense, but something was really gnawing at me about that. And it really hit me in April of 2010. I live in Milwaukee, and the headline that morning is we had the worst fourth grade reading scores for African American children in the country. And that afternoon, I got a newsletter from the largest youth organization in the city boasting about all the outcomes they were achieving with the 15,000 children they serve. And that disconnect really hit me. And I thought about, if you're achieving all these outcomes for all these children, how do we still have this result? And I thought about all of the organizations I knew in the community that were doing work with kids. And I thought about all of them, I'm sure, are achieving outcomes at some level. They're all doing their best work. My kids have been actually participated in the programs of this organization and others. And I thought about all the great work that was happening. And you visit these youth centers, they're amazing. And I thought, how can we have all of this good work happening, and yet year after year, this is the headline? And so I went back to our council and said, can we stop looking for that silver bullet, for that one program, that evidence-based? Is there a city where the data's changed? Are there communities where the needle's moved? And right as we began this exploration, this article came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called Collective Impact. And as I like to say, they did not, John Caney and Mark Kramer, who are dear friends and colleagues, did not invent collective impact. They were describing something that already existed. And what they found was in these cities where groups had come together, all the groups who worked on an issue came together and developed a common agenda and worked together to move the needle. And they described 3 communities where this happened. Our White House Council found 22 cities where a population level measure had moved by 10 points or more. And when we looked at those 22 cities and what was happening, we found the same things that John and Mark were finding in their article. And one of those happened to be my own city, Milwaukee. Our Milwaukee for over 20 years had been number 1 or number 2 in the country in teen pregnancy. We were the highest in the country. We were 2.5 times the national average. 2.5 times the national average. And the United Way and the City Health Department brought together a summit of all the people who worked on this. And the first thing that they figured out when they brought everyone together was that almost everyone in the room served girls, and they realized was another part of the problem. The other thing is they looked at data together, and they tried to make sense around the data about the issue. And one of the data points that seemed to surprise everyone in the room was that the majority of teen births in Milwaukee, the father was over 18. And they realized there was another problem in the community none of them were working on. They developed a set of 3 strategies and figured out how to do them at scale. And one of those was a major public relations campaign, and these ads were everywhere for several years in the city. And I have to ask at this point, which do you think was the most controversial ad? I love telling this story abroad because it's an only in America story. There's an association of snake owners that want to increase the kinds and types of snakes that can be imported domestically as pets, and they don't like snakes presented in the media as devils and predators. And so while taking on the issue of teen pregnancy and funding a lot of programs, including contraception, it brings a lot of controversy, the last thing they expected was to be attacked by the snake lobby. But the result of their work is that the rate's gone down every year since 2006. And as of, I haven't looked this year, but as of the last report, it's down 70%, 70% from where it was at the beginning. The national average has gone down, but the Milwaukee average has plummeted. And that's what collective impact's about. It's not about let's all work together and do something a little different. It's about what would it really take to move the needle. And we often begins with a common agenda. This idea that we build a result-based strategy that really looks at what would it really take? That we develop a rigorous set of strategies that are grounded in evidence and data, but also in people's lives and experience. And that we figure out what would it take to actually get to there. So if we're trying to reduce infant mortality in 3 zip codes where the rate's 2.5 times the rest of the city, we don't come back and say, we're going to do this educational program for 50 people a year when there's 6,000 women of childbearing age in those neighborhoods. It's what would it really take? Who would all have to be involved? What would it take to get to the scale of the problem that we're trying to reach? And too often what we do is we have these ambitious visions, and then we develop strategies that are very small. And the question is, what would it really take to cut it in half? What would it take to work with 3,000 women a year? And so as we do that, we build an agenda that's very result-based and data-driven. And once we do that, we have to have data to know how we're doing. In the teen pregnancy example, in the early years, the African American and white rates were falling faster than the Latino rate. And they knew that because they were looking at data in real time, not to evaluate, but to guide decision making. So when they saw that happening, they formed a task force on the south side of the city that created a separate set of strategies that they began experimenting with and growing because they adapted their work based on the data to make sure they were on track to get to their result. And that's what the data part of this is. It's not sharing measurements so we just can have a nice report. It's sharing measurements so in real time we can be saying, hey, truancy is up in these 3 schools. We need to get more mentors over there. It's using the data to guide decision making in real time so we're making sure that we're making progress and moving that needle. Or that we find out that all of our strategies are achieving all their outcomes, but the needle's not moving or going the opposite direction. And then we know we might not have the right set of strategies. But to do that, we have to share data and share measurement, be accountable in a way that we're not used to being. And to share in real time and use data as a way to guide discussions and decisions. The third is that we have to align action. We often have multiple organizations serving the same neighborhood, if not the same family, that don't talk to each other. And so we have to figure out, how do we actually connect and do the work? When a child is in school and they're struggling and we know they go to the after-school program every day, do they get any information from the teacher that this kid might need extra help? If there's signs of distress in that child, does their pastor know? Does their community center know? Does the counselor know? So often the people who serve families and individuals don't talk to each other. And so we have to start, if we want to solve systemic problems, we have to start acting like a system and not like a bunch of isolated actors that have nothing to do with each other. The fourth is continuous engagement. And here the focus is both about how do we communicate with the community, but especially how do we engage with those. If I'm trying to reach 3,000 women, there's no program that can do that. I can only get there through families, friends, and neighbors. So my engagement and communication has to be geared at recognizing that people in community are actually producers of outcomes and partners in efforts. And not just people who can give me a little focus group of information, but people I can activate to help us produce results. And finally, we have this notion of the backbone staff, which I think is one of the real innovations of collective impact. When I led my organization, was part of lots of coalitions over time that had great intentions. We'd come to meetings and we decide to do all this stuff. We'd get to the next meeting, almost nothing happened. And what the backbone staff does is make sure that that work happens, that the group's activated, that the commitments being made are followed through on. They collect the data, they gather the data, they convene the meetings, they facilitate them, they support people to get the work done in between, but they make sure the work gets done and the work moves forward. And so I would argue that all of this is important. These are kind of often considered the conditions of collective impact, but I would argue there's a sixth that's just as important. And that goes back to the quote before from Peter Drucker, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That if we don't be as rigorous about building a leadership culture as we do about building strategies, we will fail. And so what I'd like to do now is talk about what is the leadership culture needed to do this kind of work. And to start, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to partner with someone near you, and I'd like you to share a story with them. And I'd like you to think back to the earliest memory you have. Think back to the earliest time in your life you can remember that you stood up for yourself, that you stood up for another person, that you got involved with a cause or issue. But think back to that earliest time that you can remember that you stood up for yourself, someone, or something. And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, so about 2 minutes each. If you can share that story with each other. And I'd love to get 2 volunteers who'd share the story with the group. Thank you. Go. Find your partner and tell the story. Go. Thank you. Could I get 2 volunteers who'd be willing to share your story with the group? Come on, be nice. 2 volunteers who'd be willing to share your story with the group. Sure.
I have a microphone coming to you.
You got one? Great. If you could pass it down, please. And if you could introduce yourself and stand up, please.
Hi, my name's Rob. I'm here from Chicago, Illinois, and welcome to our city. Thank you.
Hi, Rob.
Hi. I work with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office here, which is our kind of driving agency of petitions. So the story that I shared is actually a pretty recent story. I'm a new dad. My daughter's 3. And a lot of times when I'm at the playground and I see something wrong, I forget that I'm a grown-up. And I try to be cool with older kids, and I don't take a firm stand. I'm like, oh guys, it's all right, let's be. And then the kid's like, be quiet. And I'm like, oh no, the other kids don't like me. And then I forget that I'm almost 40. So my daughter, she's in a Montessori school, and she came home, and it's not play, it's called work. And I asked her, what work were you doing today? And she's like, well, they have opposite cards. And I'm like, oh, tell me about opposites. She's obsessed with opposites. And she's like, night, day, tall, short. And she goes, boy, girl. And I said, wow, I'm not really super comfortable with this notion that boys and girls are opposites. And it's also implying a very binary system and not exactly the branding or messaging I want. And so typically with these things, I try to play it cool, or I just am like, oh, maybe we won't play with. And so I'm like, you know what? I have a responsibility to my kid. I'm paying money for this school. And so I went in and I like built it up in my head in advance. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to, either am I going to try to be cool and manipulate it, or am I going to say, hey, look, this isn't okay with my partner and I, and these are the values we have in our home, and we want an education consistent with those values. I thought I would do that, and I kind of split the baby, but I went in and I'm like, hey, look, my daughter told me this. It implies a binary state. We're not really comfortable with that. And it also implies that there's drastic differences between boys and girls, and I don't know if that's on brand with your messaging. And of course, I built it up in my head, and the woman in the school's like, oh, wow, we didn't know those cards were in there. Okay, it's done. And so, what I had built up ended up being a very simple thing, and I had readied myself for battle when in actuality it was like a commonality thing that we could all work. So that was a recent story from yesterday. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I get one more? One more. One over here. And again, if you'd stand up and introduce.
Okay. Do I have to tell who I work for? I may
Just
not
your
want to
name
say
if you
that.
want.
Okay. My name is Angela, and
Hi, Angela.
I'm from Florida, but I grew up in Georgia, and even though I don't look it, I'm 52 years old, almost 53. But this impacted me so, I still remember it. I was sharing it with someone the other day. When I was in 3rd grade, I remember this. I was living in Atlanta at the time, and it was when they were integrating the schools in Georgia. So I was sent to a school that wasn't in my neighborhood, an all-white school, and the kids welcomed me. It was not like everything that you saw on some of the news, but everyone was so nice to me, and I loved it. And then Wayne Williams, some of y'all may remember him, when he started killing the black kids, my mom was like, no, we're moving back. We're moving back to Middle Georgia, because she had 3 black kids. So we moved back to Middle Georgia. I was sad, but I went to a new school that was predominantly black. And I thought, oh, this is going to be so great. No, I wasn't welcomed. I was made fun of. I was bullied by, people that looked like me, and they made fun of me. They said, "Oh, you must be, you act like you're white because of the way you talk and the way you dress and your hair and all that." And I thought, that's not right. Y'all look like me. So one day I got tired of it, and I stood up for myself, and I got in a fight with Josephine Jones. I still remember. And I beat the brakes off that girl. And after that, nobody bothered me. I mean, because I had long pigtails and they used to, but nobody bothered me, and we all got along. I mean, I graduated with those girls from high school, and to this day, they try to friend request me on Facebook. I don't accept them. But what it did, it impacted me so that I started hanging around with people who accepted me, and it was all the white people. So most of my friends became white. I had some black friends, but most of my friends were white because they accepted me. They didn't make fun of me. And then in turn, I married a white man. My children are now mixed. So I'm just telling you, that impacted me so that it changed the rest of my life.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So now I just have to announce, ladies and gentlemen, Josephine Jones and the Chicago Montessori principal. Please come in. So, I was walking with the mic, I was kind of channeling Phil Donahue there for a second. So the reason why I start with that question and that activity is because, as it was mentioned, I wrote a book called Everyone Leads. And it doesn't mean that everyone should be in charge at the same time. What it does mean is that leadership is a muscle. And like every other muscle in our body, it only gets stronger with exercise and practice. And the important thing to understand is that, one, that every single person has this muscle. Everyone has it. And that the goal of any organization or community is, how do you build the collective leadership muscle of a group of people to get things done? And that's what really I want to focus on with the rest of our time this morning. And I want to start with a couple stories. Business Talbot Scott was an 18-year-old single mother. She had a child of 15. She was in community college in Milwaukee. She came to my organization, Public Allies, and she describes herself at this time as knowing she was smart but having no idea of her potential. She ended up working at an after-school program, recommitting to her own education, while she did that. She got into Marquette University in Milwaukee, did very well. Went to University of Michigan for law school, made the law review, clerked for a federal judge, all while raising her son. Ended up at a private law firm in Washington, D.C., and then in the Obama administration rose to become director of presidential personnel at the White House. Most people don't look at a single-teen mother and think there's a White House lawyer. Peter Hoffel was a different kind of story. Peter was 27 years old. He went to college. He got a degree in philosophy, which meant that he worked at a deli. And they had the coolest sandwich names. Really ironic, really deep. And one day a woman from Public Eyes, my organization, came in and asked if she could hang a poster in the deli advertising that we were looking for young people who are passionate about making a difference and would help them begin careers working for social change. And he struck up a conversation with her, and he describes himself at this point as someone who stayed up late at night with his friends talking about politics and social issues, but never thought he could do anything about them. So the first thing he did, he said, is after she left, he tore the poster down. He said he didn't want anyone else to know about it so he could get in. He ended up working at a legal aid organization and specifically working with people with disabilities, and found he had a passion for that population. Today, he's the CEO of NAMI of Greater Milwaukee, the National Alliance on Mental Illness chapter, and he's become one of our state's top disability rights advocates. And again, most people wouldn't look at the person making your sandwich and think there's a leader we need. I had the joy of doing that over 5,000 times, looking for leadership where no one was looking, and finding that that muscle really could be built among all kinds of people. That we had every single kind of person you can imagine, and we saw that if people have the will and desire to make a difference, that leadership muscle can be built, and that when you actually built a collective leadership muscle of a team or group, you could accomplish so much more. The reason why I'm so passionate about this is that was me. I was someone who grew up struggling with addiction and depression. I was institutionalized in my teens. I was homeless when I was 18. I was someone who went to college through a vocational rehabilitation program, was receiving counseling and other support. I was a product of social services in many ways. And as things came together, I had the desire to pay it forward, because for so many of us who I think have been helped so much, you feel almost a responsibility to give that back, but I had no idea what to do with that. And I was at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I got a chance to go to this conference in Racine, Wisconsin. And I sat down the first night at dinner next to this woman from Washington, D.C. And she told me she had just started this new nonprofit there called Public Allies that was trying to find young people who are passionate about making a difference and help them begin careers working for social change. I said, that's exactly what I want to do. How can I do that? And she said, why don't you start one in Milwaukee? And with all the experience I had as a gardener and a telemarketer at an insurance agency, I decided I was going to start a nonprofit organization. And I wouldn't have imagined that 3 years later I'd become the national CEO, move its headquarters to Milwaukee, help grow it to 23 cities, and become an advisor to president, many other things I've had the opportunity to do. But it's my experience and the experience of so many young people I worked with, like Peter and Biz, that make me believe what's possible when we think differently about who leaders are and how we develop leadership. The way we came to define it was at first that leadership's an action everyone can do, not just a position few people can hold. When we shift our thinking from the noun to the verb, it really opens up the possibility of who can participate and what it means. The second is really the essence of leadership. If you think about what leadership is, it's essentially an active responsibility. It's stepping up and owning a result. It's deciding, I'm going to make this happen. It's deciding, you know what, I'm not going to let them use these cards as opposites. It's deciding, I'm not going to let people bully me. But whatever it is, it's when we step up and own a result. And that's why no one can really give you leadership, and no one's really entitled to leadership. It's a responsibility you have to own and be accountable for. But then if you think about those leaders who make the greatest difference, those you most admire, those that you don't admire, the best boss you had or the worst, it's usually not how technically smart or skilled they were in their work. It's all about values. Do they practice what they preach? Do they hold themselves and others accountable to the same standards? Are they collaborative? Are they inclusive? Are they ethical? Do they listen? When you think about the leaders you most admire, it's always about values. And yet, so often we talk about building leadership, we talk about building leadership skills, when really the secret sauce is in values. And so I want to spend more of our time today talking about values, but before I get to values, I want to tell a story to you all that I think illustrates this idea of collective leadership and collective leadership muscle. And it's a story that you all know, but I'm going to tell it to you in a way you might not have heard it before. And it's the story of Mrs. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And we have to start with Mrs. Parks. She was a lifelong rebel and radical who got into fights when she was mistreated as a child. She had always stood up for herself. In 1932, she fell in love with her husband Raymond, who was a barber, because of his activism. He was involved in a case called the Scottsboro 9 case, in which 9 young men had been falsely accused of rape, and the Communist Party of America financed their criminal defense, and he became a community organizer in the effort. And she said it was his activism she fell in love with, and he was the first person radical enough for her to marry. In 1943, they went to their first NAACP meeting. Her friend Johnny Carr had told her that Edie Nixon was running to be president of the local chapter. The NAACP at that point had been the organization of the professional class, the educated class of African Americans. And they were working class people. But Johnny had told her that that night Edie Nixon was running to be president of the local chapter, and if elected, he'd be the first working class president of an NAACP chapter in the country. He was a porter on trains, and he had registered them to vote the summer before. And so they went to their first meeting, and sure enough, Nixon gets elected president, but no one runs to be secretary that night, and Rosa Parks is the only woman in the audience at the meeting. And so at her first meeting, she gets railroaded into becoming secretary of the NAACP, a position she held for the next 12 years. Now, the thing to pause on for a moment was to recognize in this role is her job to document all the cases of mistreatment, discrimination, abuse, and terrorism in the community for over a decade. She was the repository and documenter of all the community stories. Through the NAACP, she went to trainings in Georgia and Florida by the master organizer, Ella Baker, who was the national field director of the NAACP and had been building leaders throughout the South for an emerging movement. And Ella Baker became a key mentor in her life, and among other things, encouraged her to create a youth council in Montgomery, which she did, in which she would meet with young people on Sunday afternoons at her church and work with them on ways they could stand up to segregation. Then one day she was working in her job as a seamstress for Clifford and Virginia Dewar, who were kind of the town's leading white liberals. Clifford had been a New Deal lawyer of the Roosevelt administration who had moved back to Montgomery, and his wife was an activist. And they were talking to her about her NAACP work when they encouraged her to go to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, where they ran trainings in nonviolent civil disobedience for diverse groups of activists from the South. And when she expressed interest, Virginia Dewar raised the money from her friends to sponsor Rosa Parks to go to Highlander, and actually took the bus with her to Knoxville, Tennessee to make sure she got there safely. At Highlander, she was trained by Septima Clark and Miles Horton, who also became key mentors in her life. And they saw her as a real emerging leader and began corresponding with her and supporting her work in Montgomery. She said that Highlander had a profound impact on her life, and that was the first time she had lived in an interracial community where everyone was treated equally, and it gave her a vision of the society she wanted to live in. And I have to pause here for a moment just to acknowledge that the Highlander Center was burned down just in March this year by white supremacists who left Nazi and other insignia down there. But this center that was a cradle not only for the civil rights movement, but the labor movement and many other movements was burned down just months ago in 2019. Then a young lawyer moved to Montgomery, Fred Gray, who was 24 years old. He was the first African-American lawyer in Montgomery and the second in the state of Alabama. And Rosa Parks took him under her wing, and every week she took him to lunch, and she brought all these cases she'd been documenting for over a decade and working with him to see which ones could be turned into legal cases they could prosecute under the law. Then in February of 1955, Claudette Colvin, who was 15 years old and a member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. How many people know Claudette Colvin's name? Just a few. Rosa Parks, Virginia Dewar, and others thought they should use her case to take on the segregated bus system in Montgomery. But the lawyers, who were all men, said she wasn't sympathetic enough. They said she was too poor. They said she was just a teen, no one's going to believe her. They said she was too dark-skinned. They said she allegedly resisted arrest. In the end, they decided not to take her case. 8 months later, in October of 1955, Mary Louise Smith, age 18 and a former member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. How many people have heard her name before? Once again, Rosa and others had fought for her case, but the lawyers go to her home. Her father's a drunk. They're very, very poor. And they decide she wouldn't be a sympathetic enough figure to build a case around, and they don't take the case. 6 weeks later, on Thursday night, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus and gets arrested. How many people have heard her name before? Good. So it's important to note here two things. First is that this wasn't the first time she'd done this. This was the second time she'd been thrown off that bus by that bus driver for refusing to move. It was the first time she was arrested, but she had done it before. The second thing is that in the obituaries when she died in the newspapers, and even in the White House proclamation on the 100th anniversary of her birth, she's often described as an accidental activist or someone who inadvertently started a movement. Tired seamstress after a hard day on the job just wanted a well-deserved rest. How accidental does she sound at this point? So Edie Nixon and Clifford of Virginia Dewar go to get her out of jail, and they go back to their home, and they spend the next few hours with her and Raymond talking about the idea of using her case as the one to challenge the segregated system in Montgomery. And she and Raymond know they'll lose everything if they do this, and they did. They lost their jobs, they lost their house, they lost everything. But they agree and make the courageous choice to go forward. So Edie Nixon calls Fred Gray and asks him to represent his mentor Rosa in court that Monday. And then he called Joanna Robinson, who headed the Women's Political Council of Montgomery. The Women's Political Council was an association of African American professional women. And for 2 years, they've been urging the NAACP to organize a bus boycott. And he calls Joanna and says, we're going to do the bus boycott Monday. Can you get the word out? And Joanna's an English professor at Alabama State University, a historically black college, but a state institution. And she goes and overnight prints 15,000 flyers on state equipment using state paper and state ink. Let's mention that. But if I asked any one of you to make me 15,000 copies in the next 24 hours, you would freak out, and we have 2019 technology, and this is 1955 with a hand crank. And she got 15,000 of these done overnight. Not great graphic design, but I'll just say, like, if I asked Andy to do this tonight, you'd freak out. And all the women met her that morning. They fanned every bus stop in Montgomery with the flyers announcing that on Monday there'd be a boycott. They got them in before Friday rush hour. Then, and this is absolutely true in how it happened, Edie Nixon called Reverend Ralph Abernathy at Holt Street Baptist Church and asked him if he could convene all the pastors in town for a meeting Friday afternoon, so on Sunday from the pulpit they would all call for the boycott. And he said, I've got a better idea. There's this new young pastor in town and no one knows him. Let's do the meeting at his church, because if he gets run out of town, no one will notice. And that is literally how 26-year-old Martin Luther King was drafted into the civil rights movement. They met at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that Friday afternoon. It was the first time most of the pastors had met Dr. King. They're all impressed with the young man, but 26 years old, he was a young new man in town. And I should note that the summer before he came to Montgomery, he interned in Brooklyn, and the evaluation that went back to his theological school said he was too haughty and could not connect well to ordinary people. He was still growing his own leadership muscle. They all agreed to do the boycott. One white pastor attended that meeting, Robert Grace, who happened to be Rosa Parks' pastor. And his home was bombed 2 weeks later, and it was found out he attended the meeting. That Monday, everyone walked. They walked to school, they walked to work, they walked to shops, they walked everywhere. No one rode the bus. Everyone thought someone's going to get on, and no one got on. They had a mass meeting that night at Holt Street Baptist Church. Over 5,000 people came with standing room only. And they asked the community to vote if they wanted to continue the boycott, and the community voted unanimously to continue it. And that night they decided to create an organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association to manage the boycott. And Rufus Lewis was a rival of Edie Nixon's. He had lost several elections to Nixon to run the NAACP, and he didn't like the idea that he, a college-educated business owner, was losing to an unlearned porter on trains. And he didn't want Nixon to run this new effort, but he didn't think he could lead. But he was a deacon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and with hopes of pulling the strings behind the scenes, he gets up before the audience that night and says, we're too divided as a community. We have too many factions. If this is going to work, we need someone neutral to lead us. And he nominates his young new pastor, Martin Luther King, to be that neutral leader, which is how King becomes head of the MIA that night. King then called his father, who was the most prominent pastor in Atlanta, who connected him to a pastor in Baton Rouge where there had been a bus boycott. This wasn't the first. And that pastor said people have marched for maybe a week, and then you got to figure out how to get them everywhere. So King appointed Lewis transportation chair, and Lewis organized a 350-car carpool that transported the entire community to school, church, work, and shopping for 12 months. To raise money for this, Inez Ricks and Georgia Gilmore, two women, created clubs of women who made and sold food during the week. And every Monday they came to the mass meeting and competed over who brought the most money, which went to all the drivers for all the gas costs and all the tickets the police kept giving them. Then Ella Baker took Rosa Parks on a tour of the North to raise money from NAACP donors. The Hordens and the Dewars hit up the donors in the South. And then Bayard Rustin came to town. Edie Nixon was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, which was the largest African-American union. And its leader, A. Philip Randolph, was really dean of civil rights leadership in the first half of the 20th century. And his master organizer and strategist was Bayard Rustin. But Rustin was a controversial figure. In the 1930s, he had been the campus organizer for the Communist Party of America, trying to convert young people to communism, and we're now in the McCarthy 50s. He had then gone to India, become a follower of Gandhi, and became a pacifist. He sat out World War II in jail as a pacifist and conscientious objector to violence. And he was an openly gay black man in 1955 in New York. They called him Brother Outsider. But he was the genius strategist of the movement, and Randolph sends him down to Montgomery to support Nixon and King. And Nixon tells him about this young new pastor, and they go to Dr. King's home, and Dr. King has a man stationed on his front porch with a shotgun, a man on his roof with a shotgun, and Dr. King's carrying a sidearm. Up to that point, as they march, all the marchers carried weapons to protect themselves against the white supremacists. And Rustin sits down with King and Nixon and talked about the idea of using this movement to practice a Gandhian nonviolent civil disobedience campaign. And King had read Gandhi in graduate school and was quite interested. And Rustin said, first, no more weapons, get rid of all the guns. He said, secondly, 85 members of the Montgomery Improvement Association have now been indicted by the local police. Can you organize them to put on their Sunday best, march down to the jail, and turn themselves in? Which they did. It was the first mass civil disobedience of the movement. But they were worried that this gay communist pacifist from New York would be found behind the scenes in Montgomery. So he moves into a hotel room in Birmingham, where he coaches and counsels King every day for the next year. And in fact, he and Ella Baker co-found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Ella Baker becomes its first executive director to create a platform for a national civil rights movement coming out of Montgomery. And he's the man who organized the March on Washington and much else. But Ella Baker, Rosa Parks had been an officer of the NAACP for over a decade. Her husband had once been a community organizer in an effort funded by the Communist Party. So in the end, they decide she also won't be a sympathetic enough figure to win a national case on civil rights. So yet another woman who had refused to move to the back of the bus and been arrested, Aurelia Browder, how many people know her name? It was her case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court that overturned segregation in the South. So the question is, who is the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott? That's how change happens. How do you create a table like that, where lots of different people with lots of different skills and experience and networks can all step up and own responsibility for their contribution to the ultimate result? That's how leadership happens, is we create that space, we create those tables where from the teenagers to the bar owner to the cook to the lawyer to the pastor, that we create space where everyone can see how they can lead together by owning responsibility for their contribution to the ultimate result. And when I talk to funders, I always ask, if that was the board of an organization, would you give it money? The most profound social impact probably in history, and most of the people who have posters of them wouldn't have given them a dime. But how do we think about the community in that way? And think about the leadership tables we can build to work on our issues. Where do we see that leadership possibility within people? And there's a lot of people in that picture that a lot of folks wouldn't have seen leadership possibility within, and they changed the world. Second thing I want to talk about is really the values of leadership, and there's 5 that I want to focus on today. And first, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to partner with someone, and here's the trick. It can't be someone immediately seated next to you. I'm going to make you get up a little bit. And I'd like you to spend a few minutes, and I'd like you to interview that person with these 3 questions. And I'll tell you the significance and story behind these questions when it's done, but I want you to do it first. So find a partner, not someone seated immediately around you. You're going to quickly interview each other with these 3 questions, and then I'll call you back and tell you the story of where this comes from. Thank you. Go. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. So about 25 years ago, in Ohio, there was a pastor who was new to his church, and his church operated a soup kitchen. And he said he visited the soup kitchen, and he thought it was one of the most depressing things he had ever seen. And he met with the volunteers from his congregation who organized the soup kitchen. And he was trying to understand a little bit about how they organized it. And one of the things they told him with some level of excitement was that not only did they provide people food, but they would identify what other needs people had and refer them to services. And they told him that they had this intake process, and they showed him the questionnaire they used to identify what needs people had. And he looked at it and he thought to himself, so the way we start a relationship with someone is by asking these questions? And the only things that they know that we know about them are the answers to these questions? And they're questions you might imagine in intake form about their housing, about abuse, about drugs and alcohol, about employment, all these things, right? And he said, so the way we start a relationship is by learning these things, and the only thing they know that we know about them are these things. And he said he threw it in the garbage. And he said, we're going to do a new intake process. And he said, what I want to understand is what people have. I want to understand their gifts. I want every time that someone comes here for a meal for the first time, that they're introduced to the community based on their gifts. And he called them at the time gifts of the hand, gifts of the head, gifts of the heart. This is somewhat adapted from it. But what happened is that as they introduced people, they found the most common skill that people had who were coming to the soup kitchen was cooking. So he told the volunteers, stop making food, they've got that. And what he did is he created a wall of fame in the cafeteria, and it took Polaroids of people. For the millennials and younger, you can Google that. But they put the Polaroids up on the wall with a list of people's gifts. And his challenge to his congregation was no longer feeding people, but building relationships with people based on shared interests and gifts. And he broke down the ceiling between what had been a church community and a church basement community and created one community. And they went on to do other forms of community development. And what he was doing was something we call being asset-based. And the best way to think of it is the proverbial glass, and the age-old question, is it half empty or half full? And the correct answer is yes. It's both. That every single one of us, everyone we work with, everyone we serve, has fullness. We all have gifts and talents, all the things you just shared with each other. But all of us also have emptiness. Things we don't do well, mistakes we've made, regrets we hold. Yet what brings us into a room like this is your gifts. But my guess is if we did investigative journalism on all of your lives in great detail, we would find you also have some emptiness. My children would think the funnest day in their life is if they got to do a panel discussion after one of my talks on my emptiness. And they would gladly tell you all about all the things I don't have. We all have both. But the problem is that the way that community service is often thought of is people who are defined by their fullness going into communities that are defined by their emptiness to help people who've been labeled by their emptiness with the notion our job is to fill them up with our fullness. And that at best is arrogant and at worst oppressive. We think that great leaders are those that even when staring into a community or individual's emptiness, finds that fullness. That we start with what someone has. That someone knows that we see them in the dignity of what their gifts are, not in the sadness of what their needs are. And we all have both. It doesn't mean we're denying those needs exist. It doesn't mean, but think about your closest friends, your confidants. Your closest friends know your emptiness more than anyone else, right? But the reason why you can be vulnerable and share that with them is no matter what you share with them, they'll always see and define you by your fullness, that they'll always see you for your greatness too. And that's why we can share that. Yet we get into community service situations and we start interviewing someone and all they know that we see is their weakness, and we don't know why we don't build a relationship and why they don't share more with us and why they're not honest and transparent. And it's because they don't see that we see them in all of their greatness, in their gifts, and that we have emptiness too. And when we begin to think like that, it allows us to also start to see things differently in communities. And we start recognizing that our communities are filled with assets and opportunities that we often don't think of. It also means we start thinking of relationships as the main way to activate people around issues. And so when we think like this, it means that we recognize that someone like Andre Lee Ellis in Milwaukee, who woke up on a Saturday morning and saw a couple boys hanging out across from his house. And he called over to them and asked them if they wanted to help him clean his alley. And if they did, he'd pay him $20 and feed him lunch. And he did that, and the next Saturday he woke up, there were 4 or 5 kids hanging out across the street from his house. Paid him each $20, fed him lunch. The next week there were 8 or 10 kids. He started calling his neighbors, hey, can you come over today for lunch and bring $20? And as you see, it grew to a point where 50, 60, 70 kids were showing up at his house on Saturday mornings. And what happened? Nonprofits started looking at it, and foundations. How do we replicate this? How do we measure it? Do we know the outcomes? Do we know if the kids who help clean the alley are doing better in school than those who don't clean the alley? And is this a replicable model? And how do we scale this? And organizer our city basically told the community, stay the hell away. There is nothing you can do but destroy this. And the reality is that there are homes in our neighborhoods that are community centers. There are women who check in on the young mothers in their neighborhood that are part of public health in our communities. There are men who watch the kids on the playground after school who are part of youth development. There are all sorts of things that happen in communities every day that don't happen through nonprofits or government agencies, but happen through people helping people that we miss. And when we don't see that, we start to see the community as objects of service and we as providers of service, instead of recognizing that communities are filled with people serving each other all the time. And there's assets we can build on, and we can grow, and we can engage, and we can support. Another example of how we think like this is in southwestern Wisconsin. Some of you may know that, and it shocked me at first, the farmer suicide rate in America right now is double the veteran suicide rate in America. That if you take my home state of Wisconsin, about 500 to 600 dairy farms have closed a year for about the last 20 years. Those are families, multi-generational family farms. And often someone feels not only that they failed in business, but they failed their parents and their ancestors, that their whole identity was wrapped up in place. And so the Southwest Community Action Program is trying to address, how do we address depression in communities where there's a lot of stigma and a lot of stoicism, and where there are very small towns, that if your pickup is parked in front of the counseling center, everyone knows it's you. And they're trying to figure out how to do this. And the normal organizations say, what organizations work on this, or what leaders can we contact? What they did is they thought, who has the closest relationships with the farmers? And the answers they came up with were feed dealers, mechanics, equipment implementers, and bankers. And what they did is started meeting with those folks who work with the farmers every day and know them best, and helping them learn how to spot signals of depression and be able to give referrals to online counseling and other services to those folks. And the question they asked again that's so important was not, what are the organizations that work on mental health in the community? They asked, who has a relationship with the people we're trying to serve? Another just quick story in my city I thought was really cool is our public library system partnered with a chain of barbershops in the city, where young African American boys who were experiencing summer slide, where the grades often fall a lot between May and September, were able to take out books where they got their haircuts, and if they read the books all summer and could report on them back to the barbers, they got free back-to-school haircuts before school started. And what the library asked again wasn't, who are the literacy organizations? They asked, who has relationships with the people we're trying to reach? And so when we start to think in an asset-based way, it means that we start to understand again, not just that we look at the people we serve as filled with assets, but we start recognizing all the assets in our communities we can deploy when we're trying to solve problems. That we don't just think of organizations, but we think of people. That we recognize, how do we do work with community instead of to community or for community? Another way to think about this real quickly is that there's this spectrum that says, how do we engage our communities? It starts with inform, which is when we make decisions and we see our role as informing the community about those decisions. We can move a little further to consult, where before we make final decisions, we listen to community and hear their perspectives, and then we let them know how they influence our ultimate decision. Involve means at every level of our process, at every step, we engage the community and listen to them. And they were partners in defining the problem, coming up with options and solving them. Collaborate means we truly partner with community. They're helping produce the results. We work with them to figure out how to do things. We actually support community members as partners of ours in producing outcomes, not just advising them. And empower means we give the community the power to actually do the work. And we support their decisions. And we give them resources for their ideas. And the challenge I see among organizations is too often we use language on the right side of the spectrum and deliver engagement on the left side, which just pisses people off. And so we have to make a promise, and we have to fulfill that promise. but all of us should be thinking, how can we do more to make the community part of our solution and not just a problem we see it's our job to work on? The second is about equity and racial equity and the importance of this work right now. And first, we have to recognize that there's a history in our country. And if any of you haven't seen the 1619 Project that the New York Times unveiled Sunday, it's an amazing resource filled with articles and resources. But we have to recognize that our communities often look the way they do for a reason. It's not accidental. It's a result of very systemic decisions made over a long period of time. And not only that, but we know still today, when I mentioned the Highlander Center was burned down 3 months ago, or we see the disparate outcomes in different systems that still happen today, we know this exists. And we have to first, as leaders, be willing to honestly assess and dismantle where is there bias in our systems, where are differentiated outcomes happening. But we also have to think about equity in our work. And there's a lot of focus right now on having an equity lens. And the equity basically says, historically, social services have had an equality frame. And an equality frame is, we want to provide the same service to everyone in hopes that, and the goal is to get everyone access to that equal service, that then everyone will get the same result. But what we know is we can provide people the same service, but they don't get the same result. People start in different places. They start with different impediments. They have different challenges. And so equity lens asks us to use something that's often called targeted universalism, where we understand what's the result we want. We want kids to read by 3rd grade. And we disaggregate our data and understand which groups within our community are further behind than others. And we look at the differentiated factors, the different factors that those communities face than others, and we differentiate our services. So we don't provide the same thing to everyone, but we differentiate what we do so we can move everyone to that common result. And that's been an important focus. But I would argue as important as an equity mirror. Looking in the mirror and asking, who's making the decisions at the table? And defining the problem, defining the work. And one way I like to think about this is, how many of us at the tables where we're making decisions live in the neighborhoods that we serve? Or even have family members who live there or have lived there in the past? How does our table demographically reflect the community that we're serving? Do we have people from other marginal populations at our table? How many of us at our table have lived experience on the issue we're working with? Or even have family members with lived experience? How many of us work and are in proximity with the people we serve every day? Or even supervise those who do? And too often, the places where decisions are made are all on the outside of that circle. And I would argue, if you're on the outside, do you really have the best information about the issue, the population, and the neighborhoods to make the best decisions about what's needed and what's going to work? And so often we have what I call the Elon Musk problem, which is this. There were a bunch, do you remember last year, around this time, there were a bunch of Thai young soccer players who were stuck in a cave due to flooding? And there was this rescue effort because they were stuck in this cave. And Elon Musk tried to come to the rescue. Iron Man, right? And he said, I have the best engineers in the world. We fly rockets to space. We've built electric cars and homes and everything. And he had his best engineers come together and overnight invent a submarine that would rescue these boys. Except for one thing, it didn't work. It couldn't work with the dynamics of flow within that space. But there were cave divers. And the cave divers understood the dynamics of water within the caves. They understood the cave system themselves. And they were able to build a solution that rescued all these boys. So what happened after that happened? Does anyone remember what happened? What did Elon Musk do? He attacked the cave divers on Twitter, of course. In fact, accusing them of being pedophiles. And this is what we often see in community. The experts think they know best. Don't ask the people who actually are in community and know how things work. But the people in community know how things work are the people who actually have expertise that can help us. And then if they don't accept our help, we attack them. And what I would argue is that we have to blend content expertise with context expertise, and it takes both to create solutions. And so I'm not saying that those with expert opinions or those outside of community should be part. Of course they should be part. but it should be balanced with those who have that context expertise and know how things work on the ground and in community. And when you have both, that's what creates something powerful. The third is around collaboration, which is all about trust. And here the key idea is that the absence of conflict is not a positive measure of collaboration. In fact, quite the opposite. But there's two kinds of conflict. There's conflict which happens in a room, where we give each other constructive feedback, where we debate and deliberate ideas, where we hold each other accountable, and that's constructive conflict, and that creates innovation and learning. Then there's destructive conflict, which is when we go to the parking lot and complain about everyone in the meeting and what just happened. And that produces nothing of value. And the question is, how do you bring the parking lot conversation into the room? And that's all about how you build trust. How do you build transparent and fair processes? How do you build trust and relationships among people? How do you make sure there's not a meeting before the meeting that's a real meeting? And that you have a real culture in your meeting and group and ground rules for how people participate. And they've built relationships and trust. And when you do that, they say trust moves at the speed of collaboration, and that's really true. The fourth is continuous learning. And about 10 years ago, the Echoing Green Foundation in New York asked me to speak to their fellows about how I built public allies. They fund social entrepreneurs around the world starting new nonprofits. And I started working on this speech about what we did, and I realized it wouldn't help them. So I created a different speech called The Worst Practices of Social Entrepreneurship. And I cataloged the 10 biggest mistakes I or my organization made in our first decade that I'd do over if I could. And before sharing this publicly, I thought I should share it with our staff. But I was kind of scared that morning because the first slide of the deck was called Things I Suck At. And the reason was because I realized that if I'd been more self-aware of what I wasn't good at, I would have hired better, I would have delegated better, I would have collaborated better. I would have been less defensive. I just would have been a better leader, a better boss, a better partner. But putting this list in front of my employees was really scary. And then something happened. Everyone started nodding. And the reason is because the things you suck at aren't a secret. If you're always late, everyone knows it. If you talk too much, everyone knows it. If you say nothing in the meeting and everything on the phone and in the parking lot, everyone knows you do that. Whatever it is, everyone knows. And we have a choice as a leader. You can own these things, which create the possibility that people talk about them with you, or you don't own these things and they talk about them without you. Why are we in the parking lot complaining about Nancy for the meeting? We're there because Nancy, we don't think is self-aware enough that we can give her that feedback in the meeting. But if she says, listen, I have a tendency to dominate meetings and talk too much. If I'm doing that, let me know. That's a hell of a lot easier. And she might be defensive when we bring it up, but at least we have the opportunity to have a conversation, and it saves us hours of time on the phone and in the parking lot after the meeting. And again, if we can be confident in what we bring and hold humility about what we don't, all those things you shared earlier, if we have confidence about all our gifts, and know that's why we're in the room, but also have humility about what we don't bring, which is why we need each other, why we have to be inclusive and collaborative, none of us has the whole package. That's the secret to great leadership, is having that blend of confidence and humility. And finally, it's the issue of integrity. And integrity really, if leadership is an active responsibility, the price of leadership is accountability. And as a leader, the integrity is how we hold our accountabilities together. We have to be accountable to our own purpose and values. All of you who choose to do this work felt called to it for some reason. You care. Lots of people don't care. You care. And you have values that led you to care, and experience and mentors and people in your life and family and faith and other things. And how do you hold yourself accountable to that? How do you hold yourself accountable to those who you make commitments to in your work, day to day? And how do you ultimately hold yourself accountable to the community that you serve? And how we hold all that together is our personal backbone, our own integrity as a leader. And so I would argue that if we think of leadership as an action we can take, if we think of it as something everyone can do, if we think of it as an active responsibility where lots of people can step up to own their contribution to results, and if we think about values we can practice that can allow us to work together better, to be more asset-based in our approach with each other and our communities and the people we serve, to be more inclusive and and equitable in terms of how we think about our work with communities, and especially marginalized communities. If we think about how we build trust in an environment and transparency so we can work together better, we can create a place where we can have confidence in what we bring and humility about what we don't, and own our mistakes and lessons and fail forward. And we can have the integrity and accountability that allows us to get work done effectively and have integrity as a leader. If we can do all of that, that's what it takes to do collective work and collaborative work in communities. So I want to thank you all and just share one thing, and I'm sorry I didn't create space for questions, and I apologize for that. But I'm happy to do it over Twitter or talk to people after, but also just note that a lot of the things I talk about are in the book, but a lot of them are articles that are free and on my website, so feel free to reach that. And I'll share the slides from the presentation today, which can be shared out with the group as well. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your conference. Thank you this morning.